In this demo, we're going to see some ways that we can handle exceptions that happen within our LINQ pipelines, targeting specific stages in that pipeline and enabling ourselves to suppress those exceptions and carry on iterating through. And for this demo, I've just got a very simple LINQ pipeline. We've got a list of URLs. We're going to download the HTML from each of those URLs, and then we're going to see whether the HTML contains the term Azure or not. And as you can see, one of the sites is a URL that doesn't exist. So we expect that when we run this, we're going to get an exception. And that's exactly what happens. Partway through iterating through our pipeline, we get a web exception, and that means that we won't carry on and download any of the rest of the sites. But let's say we'd like to carry on, and even though we failed to download one of the sites, we'd like to try the other ones as well. How can we do that? Well, probably the simplest approach is simply to add a try catch actually inside our Lambda expression. So in the select statement, I've added some curly brackets because now this Lambda expression has multiple statements, and I can put a try catch block within there. In the try, we can call download as string, and in the exception block, if we want, we could write out some diagnostic information. Here I'm just writing to the console. But you'll also notice in the catch block I have to return something because the select method always has to return. And so I've chosen to return null. And the trouble with that is it does mean I need to add another stage to my pipeline to filter out any nulls so that the next line, which is doing a regular expression match, doesn't itself throw an exception because it's been given a null parameter. And so you can see that when we run this, we get the results that we wanted. We've written to the console the error message for the one site that didn't download, but then we were able to carry on and discover that my website does happen to mention the word Azure. Now, of course, this does make your pipeline look a little bit ugly to have this try catch block in the middle of a Lambda expression. So the most natural thing to do to solve that would be to refactor the contents of that Lambda expression into its own method. And so you can see that I've done that here. I've now got a method just called try download as string, and that returns a download result object, which will either have HTML for the sites that did download or an exception object for the sites that didn't. And you can see the implementation of try download is very simple. It's just got the try catch around download as string and returns a download result either with the result or the error. But although this has cleaned up our pipeline a bit, it hasn't really solved this problem where we needed to put a where clause in to filter out all of the ones that had a problem. And in fact, I've needed an additional select here to pull out the HTML after we've filtered out the error ones. So can we come up with anything better than this? Well, one option is to create our own LINQ extension method that will automatically suppress exceptions for us. And we could call this try select. And so here you can see an example of a pipeline with a try select method. The first parameter is the lambda that's actually going to transform each element in the input sequence, and in our case it's just download as string again. And I've also given this try select method a second parameter that you can pass in a simple action to do anything you like with the exceptions that it captures and suppresses. And so here I'm just writing to the console. And the advantage, as you can see from this pipeline of this method, is that now I don't need to do any filtering out of sites that fail to download. Try select is doing that. So let's have a quick look at how try select is implemented. And as you can see, it's a standard extension method. It operates on an IEnumerable of source objects, and we pass in a selector function that can turn a source object into a result object. So this again is a completely generic extension method. It will work on any type. But then the final parameter is this action that we can perform on any exceptions that we catch, and that will allow logging. And as you can see, the implementation is fairly simple. We're going to for each our way through the source sequence, and inside a try block we're going to perform the select action on each element in that sequence. If we catch an exception, we'll call the exception action, but we won't yield any result. If, however, the select action executed successfully, we set this success flag, and that means we can yield the result. By the way, if you're wondering why yield return isn't inside the try block, that's because that's something that the C# compiler won't actually allow us to do. But you can see here that this method isn't that complicated. Let me just run this and prove that it works. And as you can see, we see our error downloading message for the one URL that couldn't be downloaded, and then we see that we carry on and we enumerate through the rest of the sequence, again finding the one site that does contain the word Azure. Now unfortunately there isn't anything like this in LINQ, and probably the reason for that is that there are quite a variety of different ways that you could implement this, and how exactly you do it depends on your needs. For example, you might decide that you want it to only catch exceptions of a particular type, like web exception, and that's possible if you make a few small changes like you can see here. So down in the implementation, I've specified that the exception action now takes a T source, so we can see what element we failed on, and a T exception where T exception derives from exception. And so in the exception handler here, we're catching only exceptions of that particular type. So if you wanted to say, I only want to suppress exceptions that are web exceptions, but not exceptions of any other type, then you could do something like this. So hopefully that gives you some inspiration for how you could add your own custom exception handling into your LINQ pipelines and handle exceptions just the way that you need to for your application.